Legacy Precious Metals is the company that I trust to give you good and patient counsel for investing in your retirement. The Biden administration has caused a financial crisis, and they have no clue how to fix it. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and when oil prices go up, not only do your expenses go up, but the cost of transportation and shipping spikes, leading the prices of goods to rise. And we are already seeing record inflation. That's the last thing that we need. Our economy is in trouble, and you need to take steps to protect yourself. If all your money is tied up in stocks, bonds, and traditional markets, you may be vulnerable. So gold is one of the very best ways to protect your retirement. No matter what happens, you own your own gold. It's real, it's physical, and it's always been valuable since the dawn of time. Call Legacy Precious Metals today at 866-528-1903 or visit them online at legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com, where you can download the free investor's guide. You can also go to my Facebook page, Jenna Ellis. I am a public figure on Facebook, and I just posted yesterday a really great interview with the president of Legacy Precious Metals, who is discussing why you need to start your retirement account even if you're in your 20s or 30s. There is always a great time to protect your retirement and invest, just like you want to protect your health over the long term. So go to Legacy Precious Metals at legacypminvestments.com or call 866-528-1903.
As a constitutional law attorney, former senior legal advisor, and personal counsel to President Donald J. Trump, Jenna Ellis believes in the rule of law and the importance of integrity in our elections. And she's ready to tackle the big cultural and legal issues facing America. This is the Jenna Ellis Show. Here is your host, Jenna Ellis.
Greetings, friends. My name is Mike Donnelly. I'm sitting in for Jenna Ellis today. You can probably tell by the different tone of voice that I have. But Jenna's off today trying to save our country, and I am so pleased to be with you today. I know that if you're part of Jenna's audience, that you care about our country and you want to think about ways to save our republic and restore our republic to what it was intended to be. And so if you'll just give me a few more minutes, maybe the next 30 or so, I think our next guest is going to knock your socks off, honestly. But a little bit about me, like Jenna, I'm a lawyer, but please don't turn me off just yet. I'm not that kind of a lawyer. In fact, James, I don't know, James is the producer. James, do you know why they bury lawyers 10 feet deep in my home state of West Virginia?
I do not.
It's because deep down lawyers are really good people.
That's beautiful.
I like that. Oh, yeah. Anyway, it's great. As a lawyer, we can make fun of ourselves. But folks, as I'm a senior counsel with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, the largest advocacy organization for home education. I've had the privilege of teaching constitutional law at Patrick Henry College and law school at Regent University. And before doing all that, I served in the U.S. Army, had a company. But enough about me. I know that you care about solutions for our country. And if you're like me, you believe that we have a lot of problems to solve. In fact, I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we hand our kids a country. James Madison in Federalist 47 defined tyranny this way. He said, "Tyranny is the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one, few, or many, whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective. That may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." From my perspective, sitting about only 55 minutes west of Washington, D.C., I think the biggest threat to our freedom today is an overwhelming, out-of-control federal government that has grown beyond all constitutional boundaries, or many of the constitutional boundaries that our founders established and envisioned. I look at how the federal judiciary, the legislature, and the executive have been accumulating power over the last 100 plus years. It's been a slow, gradual process, perhaps, but in hindsight, we can see how it's happened. Some of the stuff the federal government has done on its own, for example, ignoring the fact that the word education doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Yet we have a federal department of education. I was just at a conference recently where I heard Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education, restate the call to get rid of the Department of Education. She said it can do all it needs to do. all the federal functions all the functions that the government has that are federal in nature. For example, a couple of federal laws relating to individuals with disabilities and one other topic, she said could be easily handled by other departments. She says we don't need a Department of Education. So that's the federal government doing its own thing. But sometimes some of these problems that have enabled the growth of the federal government have come from our own citizens. I'm talking about through amending the Constitution, in particular the 16th and the 17th Amendment, where in the 16th Amendment, our fellow citizens about 100 years ago gave the federal government the power to tax our income. I think our fellow citizens got sold a bill of goods, and they just thought they could trust their leaders to go along with restraining bureaucracy and just keeping power limited. I mean, what could go wrong? Giving Congress the power to tax income. It was sold as a small tax on a very small percentage of people. It was just going to be for millionaires. But then came along Congress who said, well, we can do this and we can do that. And FDR who said, well, we have to have Social Security. We've got to take from these people and give to these people. Huge transfer of wealth program. We had World War II that we had to spend to defeat the Nazis, which we needed to do that, I suppose. We were attacked. We had to fight back. Then came the space race, LBJ's Great Society, the Cold War, the financial crisis of 2008, now the pandemic. Just borrow, spend. That's how we solve problems, right? And what do we get? More debt and huge inflation. Our founders knew this could happen. It was one of the reasons that they didn't want to give Congress the income tax. How about the 17th Amendment? Well, let's let the people choose senators instead of allowing the states to appoint them to represent the interests of the states. I mean, there were problems back in the day with states arguing over who should be a senator. And now today, the senators are elected by us, the people. And who do they have to please? Us, the people. And how do they do that? Just voting more spending, more welfare programs. Do they respect the sovereignty of the states? Not really. That's what's happening. When I look at these problems, I want to understand what are the root cause. And I've given you a couple of causes of these problems, but are these the root causes of the problems? You may have heard that the saying that politics is downstream from culture, right? We have the culture and then come the politics. But what's upstream from culture that's contributing to the problems of our society today? Some would say religion, lack of shared values, media, Hollywood, competing ideologies. I think all of these share a place. In fact, when you talk about religion, I think you could point back to our founders and John Adams, who said that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to govern any other. And Jenna, as you know, wrote a book called The Moral Basis for a Constitution. So there are a lot of problems with not having the same shared values in our country for sure. But one of the big contributing institutions to these problems, I think, is the education system we have in place today. You hear lots of people talking about it. It's motivating politics today. It was a decisive factor in the Virginia governor's race of this year. I was just at a conference where I heard Betsy DeVos, and I heard lots of state legislators coming together and talking about solutions for education. So I think education is something we need to talk about and look at how that's going to solve some of these core problems, which is why I am very excited to be talking with Professor C. Bradley Thompson of Clemson University, who's written a lot about this topic, and I want to get his thoughts on this. Professor Thompson is a professor in the Department of Political Science and is the executive director at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He received a PhD at Brown University and has also been a visiting scholar at Princeton University, Harvard University, and the University of London. He's published essays on topics ranging from natural law theory to Marxism, progressive education, and free market education. And Professor Thompson, welcome to the Jenna Ellis Show.
Hi, Mike. It's great to be with you on the Jenna Ellis Show today.
Oh, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for being willing to join us, Brad, if I can call you Brad.
Please.
And thank you. And folks, I want you to check out Professor Thompson's Substack called The Redneck Intellectual, which I love it. I read it regularly, where he has written a number of provocative essays under the subject of, well, among other subjects, watching the education apocalypse in slow motion. Professor Thompson, tell us a little bit about the redneck intellectual. I presume you're the redneck intellectual. So tell us, why are you a redneck intellectual? And what do you mean by watching the education apocalypse in slow motion?
Sure. I am the redneck intellectual, and I'm asked all the time why the redneck intellectual. Most people who know me don't think I fit the description, but they're wrong. Because I'm an academic and an author, I'm called an intellectual all the time. But I do not like being called an intellectual. It's one of those hoity-toity terms that I reject. So if I'm going to be an intellectual of any kind, I'm going to be a redneck intellectual, which speaks to my own family background. I come from simple people in a simple place, and my view of the world is based on reality, not on ivory tower ideas. So the Redneck Intellectual is a Substack, as you mentioned. I've had it now for 2 years, and I use it to write weekly long form essays. And in the last 9 months, I've been writing, as I think you know, a lot of essays on education, primarily K-12 education. And those essays, I think, would be divided into two different kinds of essays. Essays on the question or on the principle of what I call separation of school and state, and the related principle of abolition. I am an abolitionist, which is to say I favor abolishing the government school system. I am not a reformer of the government school system like so many Republicans are. And then the other thing that I write on a lot in my Substack essays is what is being taught in America's K-12 government schools. And in recent months, I focused on critical gender theory, critical race theory. I've tried to give a philosophic explanation for the school shootings that have been taking place in this country over the course of the last 2 decades. And in all cases, what I find is that the core source of what's happening inside America's schools is some form of progressive education, or ultimately the goal of America's government schools is socialism.
Well, let's talk about that. Since you just brought up the term abolition, I want to ask you a little bit about that, because when people think of the term abolition and abolitionist, that is normally a term reserved for talking about, getting rid of slavery and the Civil War, and it's just full of all kinds of meaning, at least from people from that perspective. So, can you tell us, why do you use the term abolition, or is it just simply being, abolishing the schools? Is it as simple as that, or is there something more to it?
No, it is in part as simple as that. As I said, I'm an abolitionist, which is to say I favor abolishing the government school system. There's no other way, no simpler way to put it than that. I am not about reforming under any circumstances the government school system. In fact, I'm opposed to reforming the government school system, because to reform the government school system is to save the government school system, and to save it is to perpetuate it. And I am not about perpetuating the government school system, because I regard it in the context of the 20th and 21st centuries to be the single most immoral institution in the United States of America. And so I, not only on my Substack, The Redneck Intellectual, but through another website, a blog that I have called edwatchdaily.com, I am trying to lead what I call a new social movement. And our motto is hashtag just walk away. And so, we're trying to end government schooling in the United States simply by having ordinary, everyday Americans just literally walk away from the government schools. And the great news, from my perspective at least, is that that's been happening over the course of the last 2 years. We now have hundreds of thousands of families who are exiting the government schools. And they're exiting for a lot of different reasons. And they're going to homeschooling, private schools, and charter schools. And I think this is the single most important social movement, in addition to homeschooling, of the last 50 years.
Well, you're right. In fact, I was at a conference of state legislators last week, and education was probably the top issue that they were talking about, and school choice was one of those. And as an advocate for homeschooling and working at the world's largest homeschool advocacy organization, we have seen that growth in home education as parents have taken on the responsibility for themselves. But I want to talk with you, Professor Thompson, because you've really been studying this issue of public schools. Can you tell us, because you just made a very bold statement, public education is, I think you said something like the single most immoral institution in our country today. Why do you think that? What is it about the schools that you would say is immoral? What is the evidence for that? And why do you say that?
Right. So first, small rhetorical point. I never say public school. It's always the government schools. And
Thank you for that clarification.
this is an important distinction. There's nothing public about the public schools. I mean, what does that even mean? The fact of the matter is they are run by and for the government. And that has always been the case. From the time the government schools were created in the middle of the 19th century until today, they were created then by and for the state, and that continues to be the case. So what that means is that they serve the purposes of whomever is in power. So in the 19th century, that might have been in favor of white Protestants, and today it's the government schools are promoting a certain kind of indoctrination. And let's never forget, government schooling, if it is by and for the state, is first and foremost about indoctrination. And what's behind that? It's the state controlling the ideas that are being taught to America's children. And that notion in and of itself, to me, is immoral. The government should never be involved in trying to shape the ideas of America's children. Think about it this way, Mike. Who in America would want the government controlling what is taught in Sunday school? And I think the answer to that question is no one. Now, if you don't want the government controlling what is taught in Sunday school, why would you want the government controlling what is taught in school Monday through Friday, right? The same argument that applies to separation of church and state applies to the principle of what I call separation of school and state. So I think by definition, it is immoral for the government to be involved in the business of filling our children's minds with government-sanctioned ideas. I also consider it immoral because the government schools are, by definition, based on force. They are based on compulsory attendance laws, and they are based on forced taxation, right? So the government schools are about force, and force and the human mind are anathema to one another, right? There should never be any association between force and the human mind. So my principle is get the government out of the business of controlling the minds of our children. So that's why I think it's immoral. Now, one last thing on that, Mike. The government schools are undoubtedly immoral today, given what they are teaching inside the four walls of the schools. I mean, I just every single day I wake up and for the purposes of my websites, I scan what's in the education news. And it's hard to imagine that every single day I can wake up and get angry all over again every single day based on what I'm seeing is being taught in America's government schools. I mean, it's genuinely horrific. And I could never, under any circumstances, send any child that I love to a government school to be indoctrinated in ideas that I consider to be profoundly immoral.
Well, I want to ask you a few specifics there in a minute, but you mentioned compulsory attendance and force. And it's interesting. One of the things I do at HSLDA is advocate for homeschool freedom around the world. And so I've made myself familiar and studied international human rights law. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 26, Part 1, it frames education in the elementary years as a compulsory right. So it says everyone has the right to education, and that in elementary years it shall be compulsory. And I have always scratched my head for the very same reason that you have just articulated, that force and the human mind, which is inextricably linked to education and bringing children up. And education really can't be neutral. It's not value neutral. It can't be value neutral. So don't think that it is value neutral. But then again, when you're talking about compulsory education, Do you make any distinction between compulsory education and compulsory school attendance? I'm just curious.
I'm not sure I see the distinction. Now, but
Well, one is when one is the government forcing you to go to school or a school that they say, yeah, that meets the criteria. The other kind of being like what the Pilgrims did back in 1642 or 47 with the old Satan Deluders Act saying, hey, people, you got to make sure your kids are educated, do it or else. That's the distinction that I'm making.
Right. Yeah,
I'm just curious if you distinguish in at all.
Yeah. Well, now, I mean, now that you put it that way, yes, I do. And I'm opposed to both. I mean, think about what compulsory means in this sense. I mean, why isn't it good enough from the government's perspective to say that we will provide free education to all children? Why is that not good enough? Why do they have to also say that it's compulsory? Well, compulsory against whom or for what? And the compulsory part is in large measure an attempt to separate the inherent link between children and their parents. The compulsory part means that the government has the power, the force to, in effect, remove children from their parents' homes and put them in a government-sanctioned school. That's why, at the deepest philosophic level, that's why these schools have to be compulsory. And that's another reason why I think they're immoral, because at the heart, and this was very clear, again, when the government schools in the United States were first created. And by the way, they were modeled on the Prussian system of education. And the Prussian system of education was very clear in its attempt to turn children away from the family and make them into good Prussians or good Germans. And that's the purpose of government schooling in the United States. It's to pull them away from the family. It's to separate children from their parents and turn their minds over to the government to receive the government's ideas. And so in that's why I think that's really what's at the heart of the term compulsory in compulsory education. It's to use force to separate children from their parents.
It's interesting you mentioned Germany, and I've enjoyed reading your Substack articles, and you gave me some really helpful content that I've been using, crediting you, of course, and telling people about your Substack as you kind of outline, the progression or the where compulsory education came from. So I would encourage people to go back and read, the connection between Prussia and the United States and Horace Mann. But I wanted to pick up on that point in the context of Germany, because what's also interesting when you talk about human rights, as I've examined the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, in Article 16.3, 26.3, 26.1 says compulsory education, but 26.3 says parents have a prior right to decide the kind of education that shall be given to their children. That was specifically done because of what the Nazis had done in Germany during the Third Reich when they nationalized the education system and were using education as a weapon. And Hitler himself said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the future. And he said that. And so you've made that link. We're making that link now about totalitarianism, about compulsion, about education. And I think you're advocating for the repeal of compulsory attendance laws. Tell me why you think, well, do you think that's possible? How could we achieve such a thing? And would people even stand for it? I mean, everybody sends their kids to public school. Well, almost everybody, less now than ever before, but still a lot.
Absolutely. And my response to this question, which I get all the time, is in 1831, there was one man in America and one man only. His name was William Lloyd Garrison, who favored the total abolition of slavery and thought slavery could be abolished. And he founded the abolitionist movement in 1831. No one thought it could be done. And 35 years later, slavery was abolished. Now, you tell me, which institution was more deeply embedded in American culture at the time? Slavery in the South or education in contemporary America? Well, I think it's actually probably pretty close. But the fact of the matter is, if slavery could be abolished in antebellum America, then I think it's absolutely possible, and I think it's even more possible today than I would have 10 years ago, that we could, well, that eventually we will move to a free market in education. The fact of the matter, Mike, is that it's happening right now as we speak, and it's happening whether Brad Thompson is writing the Redneck Intellectual and writing his essays and trying to lead a movement. The fact of the matter is, ordinary, everyday Americans are leading a prairie fire rebellion against the government schools. We've seen this over the course of the last 2 years. And as the schools implode, and they are imploding, sensible people who love their children are just going to walk away. And that's what's happening. Over the course of the last 2 years, something like well over 1 million children have left America's government schools. And that process is going to continue. And what's most stunning is the number of African American parents who have pulled their kids out of the government schools and are now homeschooling them. The African American community, as I know you know, right, is the fastest growing community in the United States in terms of homeschooling. And so I view all of these things as really very positive signs. And look, what can't go on forever won't. And this can't go on forever. I mean, the schools are literally imploding ideologically, right? We no longer teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to K through 6 students, right? The primary agenda of America's government schools is critical race theory and critical gender theory. And any decent human being who wants their child educated is horrified by what is being taught in the schools. So this process, whether I'm trying to lead a movement against the government schools, this is going to happen. It is happening, whether I do anything about it or not. People are done. They are absolutely done with the government schools, and they are looking for the exit doors.
You see a lot of people talking about that, and I talk to legislators frequently, and I wonder, at certain points you reach a tipping point, and are we at that tipping point or not? I'm not sure. And so the question is, well, can't we save the schools? I mean, if we just elect better people to school boards, or if we just give parents more input, or, if we as taxpayers just, raise our voices and we make ourselves heard, we can fix things. What do you say to that argument? Because, you've said clearly you don't think that they can be reformed. So maybe just help us think a little bit through that. Why don't you think they can be reformed? And why can't we just put better people in position and make them better?
Yeah. Announcement, newsflash to all Republicans out there. The government schools cannot be fixed, period. Under any circumstances, they cannot be fixed. And they cannot be fixed for the following reason. The government schools are run by what I call the education deep state. That's the Federal Department of Education, 50 state departments of education, the teachers' unions, the education schools or the teacher training institutions, the textbook publishers, the curriculum designers, and all kinds of other special interest groups, all of which share the same education ideology. So, for instance, in the last 2 years, state legislatures have tried to pass critical race theory bills, and they've passed in a number of states. And the teachers' unions have said, fine, whatever, we're not obeying them. And they're just finding workarounds. And the same is true of critical gender theory. So these ideas will be taught, period. And the problem with these attempts at legislation is that it just puts people back to sleep, right? Republicans can pat themselves on the back and say, oh, look, we've done a good job. We've stopped the teaching of critical race theory in the government schools, and now we can just go back to sleep. And the fact of the matter is they haven't, right? They've passed a bill, yes, but they haven't stopped the teaching of critical race theory in the government schools. That's not going to happen, right? Because, the only way that could ever happen right? You would have to abolish, which I do favor, the Federal Department of Education, 50 state departments of education, and most importantly, every ed school in America. But that's
Wow.
not going to happen.
So, okay, so you are a redneck intellectual. So you think about philosophies and ideas. Have you given any consideration to policy? I'm just curious if you've thought about or observed any of the policy things that are happening today, because what you're recommending a solution to a problem. And I suppose the policy recommendation would be just repeal compulsory attendance, or is there more to it than that?
Right. So the first thing to say is my policies would not be let's make the schools better. That's not my policy. I don't favor that. Sure, yes, abolish compulsory attendance laws. I mean, in many ways, the easiest thing that you could do to start rolling back the education deep state would be to what I call decertify the so-called ed schools, the teacher training institutions, right? Because they have an artificial monopoly on teacher certification in the United States. And all of the bad ideas that are being taught in America's government schools, they all come from the so-called ed schools. And so what I would say is defund all public university or state university ed schools, complete legislatures. Now that's one piece of legislation I would favor. Legislatures around the United States simply defunding the so-called ed schools. The second thing would be to shut down at the state level, state licensure or certification agencies, which work closely with the so-called ed schools. Right? If you take those down, then you begin to chip away at the monopoly that the ed schools have. And look, Republicans going back to Ronald Reagan have, every now and then, not all Republicans, a few, Ronald Reagan and maybe Ron Paul have argued that we should abolish the Department of Education. All right. If you're going to say it, mean it. Let's really see some Republican politicians who actually would abolish the Federal Department of Education. And I promise you, Mike, and Jenna's audience, that if Brad Thompson is elected president of the United States of America, my first action on day one will be to abolish the Federal Department of Education.
Well, we were wondering who was going to run in 24, some of us anyway, and I think we just had a breaking news announcement. Brad Thompson, are you announcing that you're running for the presidency of the United States on Jenna Ellis's show?
Well, sort of, but there's one problem. I can't because I was not born in the United States. So,
oh wait, you're not a natural born? Well,
I'm not a natural born.
Well,
sorry.
What do you mean? Where were you born?
I was born in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, on the Canadian side.
On the Canadian side, exactly.
Oh, well, okay. Well, maybe that's a problem. Maybe it isn't. But that's enough for that point.
But
I
could be the Secretary of Education, in which case my first action would be to abolish the Department of Education.
All right, all you Republican candidates for president. You just heard it from Brad Thompson. He's willing to serve as Secretary of Education. There you go. You've got one candidate for your list when you start talking and debating people. I think that's great. Brad, we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to go to another topic that you've written about. You've written a couple essays about, you call them our killing schools. And to me, this is a tragedy, what's happening. And, the left and Democrats use school shootings. They always immediately start talking about gun control as if the gun is the problem and not the person. And you've written some compelling articles about what is going on in public education and why it's contributing. And I said public education, forgive me, government schools, and why it's contributing to these issues. Can you illuminate that just a little bit in our closing minutes? Because this is so tragic, and I think your your points are very compelling, and people need to understand that this is linked to the stuff that we just were talking about before.
Sure. There is a social moral crisis taking place in the United States of America right now. And that is we have a crisis of America's 15-year-old boys walking into their local government school and committing mass murder. And the only thing that the politicians want to talk about is guns and video games. The fact of the matter is we are asking all the wrong questions. We should not be asking what is the weapon of choice to commit mass murder. We should be asking the question, why do America's teenage boys want to commit mass murder at a local school, right? They could commit mass murder anywhere, but it's a fact they are doing it at their school. So maybe the answer to the question has to do with something that is taking place inside the four walls of the schools. And so what I've tried to do in this series of essays is to give a kind of philosophic explanation for why America's teenage boys are committing mass murder. And my argument, or at least my hypothesis, is that it's connected. It's a long story. I've written this up over the course of 3 long essays. It's a very long and complicated story, but my argument can be
and it's very well worth reading. If I can say, I just want to encourage people, if you're listening to us right now, please go to the Redneck Intellectual and just go to Our Killing Schools and read them. Brad, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but it is compelling.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that very much. And my hypothesis is this: that the root cause of America's of the crisis of our teenage boys has to do with the use and abuse of progressive education in America's schools. So let me just give you one concrete example of what I'm talking about, and that is how we teach our children to read. So there are only 2 ways in which there are 2 ways that children are taught to read in contemporary America. There's only one true way, which is the phonetic method, using phonics. But in America's government schools, they use something called the whole language method, which teaches or requires children to memorize whole words rather than learning the 44 phonemes of the English language. And so what they do is children are required to memorize whole words. They're given stacks of cue cards in kindergarten to take home. And what they have to do is they have to memorize whole words. And the problem is the human mind is incapable of memorizing more than about 10,000 words. And so think about what happens to a young boy. And of course, this is a crisis of boys, not of girls. What happens to an 8 or a 9-year-old boy who's required every day to stand up in front of his classmates and is being asked to read, and he can't read? His experience, and my argument is that the reason we have a crisis of young boys in this country who can't read is because they're being taught the false method of reading called whole language. And so we have a whole generation of boys who can't read. And imagine what happens to a young boy who's asked to stand up in front of his classmates every day and he can't read. His first response will be humiliation. Humiliation will turn into anger. Anger will turn into resentment. And what happens to a generation of resentful boys? They start to act out in class. And what is America doing with its young boys who are acting out in class? They are diagnosing them with ADD, ADHD. And what is America doing with its boys who are diagnosed with ADD? We're drugging them. America's government school system has become America's single biggest drug dealer. We have an entire generation, 2 generations now of boys who have been put on Ritalin. And almost all the school shooters in this country over the course of the last 22, 23 years, most of them have been on Ritalin and psychotropic drugs. And it's a genuine crisis. And when these boys then go to the Hobbesian state of nature, which is the American high school, right? They are put into a situation where they can't properly adjust and adapt and socialize, and school becomes a form of cruel and unusual punishment. for these young boys. And eventually, some of them, a very, very, very small, tiny minority of them, actually break. And then the school itself becomes the source of their anger and their resentment.
Well, you've put your finger on some very interesting things, and I can tell you, having researched education a little bit, many parents tell me, and this is exposed in surveys, that they homeschool at least in some part because they don't want to send their kids to school that early. Because of that very reason, they want to teach them to read. They want to give them the tools so that they can be successful. And it's true, boys, they develop slower than girls. And yes, there is a difference between boys and girls. I mean, some boys can handle it, some girls can't. But on average, the research does show that boys, tend to, on average, develop a little bit slower intellectually. Not Brad. He must have, been, redneck intellectual. He somehow combined these things together. But no, he says, but and so Dr. Raymond Moore wrote a book called Better Late Than Early, based on this very issue. I don't know if you ever heard of Dr. Raymond Moore, but he was one of the early researchers in the 60s who was one of the leaders in the early home education movement. And that was one of the things he said is, especially for boys, hold them back a little bit because they're just not ready. And you've just explained, in a tiny sliver, 20, 30, 40 young boys over the last 30 years or so. But you've kind of articulated the pathway. And in your articles, you really analyze it. I mean, I think it's worth reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to follow up in one sentence and say that what we are doing to America's boys is a moral crime in this country. We are inflicting genuine cruelty on them, intellectual, moral cruelty on America's young boys, and it has to stop. It has to stop now. And I would encourage parents to get not just their boys, but all of their children out of the government schools immediately.
Well, Brad, you've made a number of provocative observations here, calling for the abolition of government schools, explaining why you think it's immoral, why compulsory education, even attendance and even education laws you think are immoral. You've articulated some of the very traumatic circumstances that we see in our government schools that have resulted in the death of scores of other children, and it's tragic. I want to thank you for the work you're doing. Agree or disagree, and I personally agree with what you're suggesting. But whether you agree or disagree, folks, we've got a crisis. We've got to deal with it. And I can tell you, my policy observation is that people are becoming aware of this, realizing that there needs to be some changes. Brad, any final thoughts here to folks as we close up our time here talking about education, compulsory education here in America? And again, folks, you can find Brad on his Substack, The Redneck Intellectual. He's written a number of books which are interesting, and I encourage you to go to the Substack and read these articles.
So I'd like to end up finally on a positive note. And the most positive thing I can say is that I regard there is a social revolution that is taking place in America right now. And that social revolution is being led by America's homeschooling mothers. They are the leaders of a new social revolution. And the people in this country whom I admire the most are homeschooling parents in general, and this army of homeschooling mothers in particular. They have assumed a kind of moral responsibility for the education of their own children, which I find deeply, deeply admirable. And so my hat off to America's homeschooling moms.
Well, I share that view, Brad. In fact, I'm married to one of those homeschooling moms. We have 7 children. We've homeschooled, and there are a million or more of these moms, and more every day. As you pointed out, the African American community, 16% of African American families are homeschooling their children. Homeschooling is growing. And folks, if you're listening and you want to learn more about how you can get started homeschooling, I wasn't going to talk about this, but you can go to youcanhomeschool.com, which is a website that will give you all kinds of information about homeschooling. I want to encourage you to read Brad Thompson's Redneck Intellectual. And, I'm hopeful about America. I think there are things that are happening that, there's a battle going on for, as you say in your articles, Brad, for the hearts and minds of America's children. I believe that's true because the classrooms of today, whether that's in a home or a government school, are the courtrooms of tomorrow. Those are the legislatures of tomorrow. Those are the professors of tomorrow. And, the country of tomorrow is being taught today. What kind of country do we want to have tomorrow? Look at what we're teaching our children today, and that will determine the country we have tomorrow. And it is a moral question. So, Brad, thank you for pointing that out. Friends, thank you for tuning in today. It's been a privilege to sit in for Jenna, and I'm going to have one more podcast. I'm not sure if it's the next one or when it's going to happen, but it's with the American Federations for Children Research Director Corey DeAngelis, and we're going to keep talking about education because, as Brad has pointed out, it's a moral question, and it's one of the most important questions we as a country are dealing with today. Brad, thank you again for being part of the show.
Thank you, Mike.
Legacy Precious Metals is the company that I trust to give you good and patient counsel for investing in your retirement. The Biden administration has caused a financial crisis, and they have no clue how to fix it. Oil prices have skyrocketed, and when oil prices go up, not only do your expenses go up, but the cost of transportation and shipping spikes, leading the prices of goods to rise. And we are already seeing record inflation. That's the last thing that we need. Our economy is in trouble, and you need to take steps to protect yourself. If all your money is tied up in stocks, bonds, and traditional markets, you may be vulnerable. So gold is one of the very best ways to protect your retirement. No matter what happens, you own your own gold. It's real, it's physical, and it's always been valuable since the dawn of time. Call Legacy Precious Metals today at 866-528-1903 or visit them online at legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com, where you can download the free investor's guide. You can also go to my Facebook page, Jenna Ellis. I am a public figure on Facebook, and I just posted yesterday a really great interview with the president of Legacy Precious Metals, who is discussing why you need to start your retirement account even if you're in your 20s or 30s. There is always a great time to protect your retirement and invest, just like you want to protect your health over the long term. So go to Legacy Precious Metals at legacypminvestments.com or call 866-528-1903. MyPillow is having their biggest sheet sale of the year. You all have helped build MyPillow into the amazing company that it is today. Now, Mike Lindell, the inventor and CEO, wants to give back exclusively to you, his listeners. The Percale bed sheet set is available in a variety of colors and sizes, and they are all on sale. So, for example, the queen size is regularly priced at $89.98, but is now only $39.98 with our listener promo code Jenna, Jenna. So order now, because when they're gone, they're gone. The Percale bed sheets are breathable and have a cool and crisp feel. These come with a 10-year warranty and a 60-day money-back guarantee, so don't miss out on this incredible offer. There's a limited supply, so be sure to order now. You can call 1-800-564-8475 and use the promo code Jenna, or go to mypillow.com/Jenna. You can click on the radio listeners square and use the promo code Jenna. That's Jenna. Thank you so much to all of Mike Lindell's listeners and listeners of this podcast for making sure to support MyPillow and using our exclusive listener promo code Jenna. That's Jenna.